Hello, and welcome to Vulnerability Phone. If you know the name of the vuln you'd like to see, press 1. Please enter the CVE now. You have selected Log4j. If that is correct, press 1. Log4j is playing at Minecraft, cloud services, security vendors, iCloud, Amazon, Apache Struts, your toaster, small children, puppies, and, well, I think you get the point by now. If you also get the reference to Movie Phone, then not only do you have to update Log4j, it's probably time to move out of the past and update your JVM to a version that was released this decade as well. Which means this week we talk with Francesco Cipollone from Appsec Phoenix about remembering the business perspective when measuring DevOps and Appsec practices. In the news segment, Log4Shell takes the JNDI out of the bottle. Mozilla is fuzzy on a big fix. GraphQL auth-z fails B2B. Path traversal, rusty kernel, a reflection on the InfoSec profession, and more. Dial up and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Looking to improve your web application security? Probly is reinventing web application security. Probly focuses on the vulnerabilities that matter, eliminates false positives with evidence-based scanning, and provides a simple point-and-shoot solution that is easy to use. Probly's thorough coverage ensures accurate identification of vulnerabilities in any modern web application or API. Improve your web application security processes by visiting securityweekly.com/Probly and start your free trial today.
This is episode 177, recorded December 13th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John, Mr. 1200 Bod Kinsella. Hello, John.
Hey, Mike. I was all working on like some sort of like an injection preview or injection hello, and you just sort of took my steam away. So, well done.
Well, we'll have plenty of steam once we do talk about some Log4j in the news segment, but we've got a great guest that we want to talk with first. But even before we can get to our great guest, we have to talk about some great announcements. Because throughout 2022, CRA's Business Intelligence Unit will be releasing research reports on the top topics across the security industry. Our first report will be on third-party risk and the supply chain. To participate in the survey, please visit securityweekly.com/third-party risk. The results will be shared at our third-party risk eSummit in January. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Francesco Cipollone is a multi-startupper and a cybersecurity professional. He is the former AppSec and cloud security lead for HSBC, lead cloud security for AWS Professional Service, and previously consulted with the United Nations. Francesco is also chair of the Cloud Security Alliance, published author, podcaster, thankfully for us, and public speaker. Hello, Francesco. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Hey, John. Hey, everyone. It's an honor to be on one of my favorite shows.
Well, thank you very much for saying that, because the honor is also, the honor is for us to hear about your insights, because in particular, we chatted a bit before the show, and what you were really highlighting is the importance of, yes, measuring DevOps, DevSecOps, AppSec, but you were really pointing that the business needs to be part of that equation, not only as the audience, but how this measurement should be presented to them. So that's kind of setting the table here. But maybe let's start a little bit just about one of the reasons you're focusing on these areas. I think you're trying to push the industry. We're going to try to avoid a common terms about DevOps, what we're doing, and get out of just vuln management and bug fixing into smarter conversations. So that's a bit of a long setup. So let me stop there and say, what's the conversation that you wanted to start around here?
No, I think it's a great topic of introduction, Mike, and thank you for giving me the input on this, because I think we focused a lot on DevOps, DevSecOps. Then we started focusing a little bit on CloudSec. Now we kind of lost where we are in this deployment mode and this kind of environment. And we lost more or less the connection with the business and the business aspect. DevSecOps has pushed the release, very, very quickly release code to production, release things fastly, being more agile, being more fast. And a lot of organizations are doing it right. A lot of others are just gluing in technology, just to mention Log4j, just once, forgetting to patch things. And things get kind of forgotten all in this process of deployment. And when we try to bring back the concept on the table with the executive, AppSec is a very, very complicated concept. And then you bring it on top CloudSec, cloud security, you bring on top traditional infrastructure, container, Kubernetes or Docker, depending on which one is your favorite. The conversation gets really cloudy really quickly for an executive. And unless you have a very savvy executive that can have an opinion on all this stuff, they kind of get lost. And what I've seen in the past, and what I've seen a lot of frustration is either developers don't get time to update until something hit the news like Log4j, and everybody start panicking on, okay, where do we have Log4j deployed and what is the impact? And let's spend the whole weekend updating the full infrastructure and start searching for what application is exposed internal and external, what is our supply chain exposure and things like that. And it shouldn't be the case at this modern day and age. We shouldn't be still panicking and going around. I mean, we've been through this process with things, with organizations that have suffered from, Apache vulnerabilities in the past. So why are we still in this kind of particular place? I don't know. I still don't know. But the answer
well, we're going to make the answer. That's why we brought you here. But I think
it'll be a quick podcast. Well, I don't know. Sorry.
It was one of the ways I like to jokingly refer to what you're describing is that people do AppSec and DevOps. They don't do bug ops, meaning they shouldn't be equating just AppSec with VM and here's a bunch of vulns you need to patch. Or DevOps shouldn't just be equated with you can fix all the vulns that get found faster because you've deployed a tool. I think what you're describing is trying to go in a different direction there. And one of those directions is not to turn your executives or your stakeholders into experts on Kubernetes by sitting them down through an 8 to 10 hour, training on this is what the container is from start to finish. It's more of what's the context for why this is important. And maybe, I think, John, I heard you coming in there to help save Francesco. So maybe I'd turn it over to you or Francesco if you wanted to pick that back up again.
Oh, I don't think I was going to save him by any length at all. I was saying if we don't have an answer, then this could be a short podcast. That was my comment.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess the question, if Francesco, if I bring it back to you, is yeah, we've been in this industry for quite a while, right? And we've seen this pattern of continuously bumping ourselves in the head. How do we? We've talked to a few really great people recently, thinking about things like discussing things like, can we do this through education? Can we educate developers when they're younger, when they're still in college? How can we sort of, what different sort of angles? I'm sort of curious from your point of view, and I think you've got some ideas on this. But how do we? Yeah. How do we sort of get? How do we stop doing the same stupid thing, basically? Help.
Yeah, and I think doing the boring stuff that is fundamentally asset management, trying to understand better how our organization are deployed, and trying to remove security people or developer or the human aspect from this, and trying to automate effectively asset management, and trying to get a bit more smart in how applications are composed. And then getting fundamentally the executive back into the mix and their buy-in, because as soon as you lose that executive buy-in, and as Mike has rightfully said, you can't put executive through, container, Kubernetes and stuff like that training, but you need to talk with them in the language that they understand and bringing them in that conversation with context and context-aware information. So not super high detailed information about how many vuln you have, but what is your risk position or how many days you could potentially lose, and what is the probability of losing fundamentally an application and the production of that application. And those are things that an executive can give a direction. And by bringing them in, fundamentally, you can have, first of all, the support, and second of all, a constructive conversation with the developer, because with that you can build an AppSec program or a CloudSec program or an infrastructure program that have targets that are aligned with the business, with the risk profile of the business. There will be the odd occasion of the vuln that pops up, but if you have a good library of your asset and where they are deployed and contextually how much they're exposed and how easy it is to get to exploit them, you have a much more proactive way to have this kind of conversation with developer. And then once you've done that, fundamentally is shifting away from this concept of vuln and vuln management that is a little bit stifled. And I've seen a lot of organizations, still defaulting on breaking the pipeline and saying, you can't deploy in production things that are that have vuln that are critical and so on and so forth, because those things will happen all the time. You kind of can't avoid that. And the more restriction you put, the more you face with people going around you. And one aspect of the industry that I saw was fundamentally people trying to solve this with human bodies and the whole traditional DevSecOps program that is very human intensive. The drawback of that is extremely expensive. Executive team can kind of get, they lose the love for this kind of program of work that are very people-centric. And in the end, fundamentally, this program dies and we back at square zero. So if we don't automate some of this stuff, if we don't automate the vuln management, the contextual aspect, and if we don't remove security people from the vuln management, we're going to lose. We're going to consistently lose. Where I see the success factor is where security team were removed from this vuln management program and philosophy, getting fundamentally dev team with a clear mandate to actually fix things and a clear line of communication with the executive, as well as having security team engineering focus and building fundamentally tools, methodology, or fixing fundamentally, the occasional Apache library that everybody can feed from it with the latest patches and the latest update, or the occasional node image that everybody downloads that by default has 100 vulnerability by default as you download it. So having a golden image, golden repository. So having security going back to doing what security is. And that's fundamentally what I think will be interesting to keep on exploring, because security is trying to figure out their footing again in this kind of fast-pacing, kind of world-changing development, DevOps, cloud ops, container ops, you name it.
What do you guys think? I think you actually anticipated one of the follow-up questions I had. I was going to, let's say we do have that conversation with the business stakeholders. We get that buy-in. A natural follow-up question then from them is going to be, okay, you've convinced me, but how much money do you need? What tool do you need? So maybe, and you touched on that a little bit, talking about trying to get out of just the vuln patching, moving, having automation. So it's not just purely people that are doing this process. But I'd like to still pick apart this topic a bit more, I think, and say, are those even good questions from the executives? What money are tools, or should we also be helping them, prompting them with different questions, different types of support that put this on a path that is actually achievable and measurable? We haven't talked about that quite yet, rather than just saying, yeah, we're going to empower our developers and then magically things will be fixed.
Yeah, no, that's a very great question, Mike. Thank you so much. And I think you touched on a very important part, that is educating also the executive on having KPI and metrics that make sense, because the first thing an executive will try to do is trying to make a decision, because that's what they're paid to do, and make a decision based on the data that they have available. If you provide, SLAs or kind of time to fix metrics, they're going to give you a number on that. So educating them on a more risk-based approach, and maybe then evolving that in a concept of trust, bringing in fundamentally use case and development use case, where user security team kind of or development team kind of auto-regulating themselves based on the metrics that they've mandated. those metrics could be, SLA in time to fix, or time to fix over X amount of quarter, or how quick are they fixing things. Measures can be anything, but bringing in back success case to an executive and say this works because despite the fact that the team have promoted in production something with a critical vuln, they detect it immediately, they act on it, and the next sprint they plan it in their backlog, they added it back, and then they fix it. So time to fix is actually shorter than maybe a team that's, have mandated certain things and, has a lot of technology debt or security technology debt, as I like to call it. So educating executive to make risk-based decision or quantification-based decision, but also talking back to them in what is the effect of those kind of decision and targets and how we can enforce them at scale. And that's what we're missing, I think, in vuln management, or if you want the modern DevSecOps word, that is, I would say that the vuln management is dead because it doesn't exist anymore as a concept. Patching an infrastructure is almost ephemeral. If you want to do so, you can deploy an image all the time that is refreshed and updated. It's doing it in a smart way, I think. And the only way we can do that and solve that, in my opinion, is if you have a security team that is dedicated to look systematically and strategically about how to help development team, not just by talking about vuln. That could be a small part of their job and should be just a small part of their job, because they should be removing this vuln management conversation and enabling them with data, with metrics, to have conversations that are contextual and story-based with executive, but also with developer, but with metrics that are sitting across the same data set. So vuln management and vulnerability data should be just the base data that people take decision on.
Yeah, I like it. Obviously, this weekend, a lot of AppSec teams and DevOps team have been in firefighting mode. But your point there, I think, at least it would appeal to me, as someone who's been within the AppSec world of trying to working on those systemic changes rather than just a constant firefighting mode. I do want to go back to mentioning. I liked how you framed that discussion around the automation. How quickly do they fix items? You started that with talking about trust, and I know this isn't a zero trust type of definition you're going into. And before this use of trust gets diluted by marketing, I'm curious, why you thought of this as trust, and what are some, additional, in addition to things like how quickly they fix items, are there other metrics that help build this trust in systems as you're describing it?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So in the early stage of this program of work, that's where we developed fundamentally the concept where AppSec Finish came from. But fundamentally, we saw that, just basing conversation around developers on, are you fixing vulnerability? Yes, no, period. You can't promote to production. It kind of dries up as a conversation really quickly and generate a lot of animosity. Well, if we go back to fundamentally the definition of DevSecOps, it relies on trusting fundamentally the team that maintain your code, your repository, your data in itself to do what's right. And there are two conditions. One, you have to trust them. And second, you need to enable them to actually do their job right. So for the first option, you need to kind of generate this concept of trust. And trust is a little bit tricky in technology, because if you start bringing in trust and KPI, then you could potentially codify this concept of trust. We had the concept of chef and receipt, and the codification of compliance already in place. So why not taking the same concept into the concept of trust? And we have the base definition of what a good team from a security perspective look like. It fix quickly, it promote quickly, and it fix quickly. So it's nothing related to if it has vulnerability. We assume breach. We assume that it's going to have vulnerability. Is the whole metric is how quickly can they respond to a log4j or another vulnerability? How quickly can they patch? And if it's in their DNA to fix it. And metrics that we saw working were originally the very basic SLA or risk-based target. But then if you want to evolve it, then you bring to the table things like mean time to resolution for a vulnerability. And then you start putting target around that, and you start comparing that to the industry factor and industry specific. And you have some industry that are very bad at mean time to resolution, like the financial world traditionally is roughly 290 days. Some other technology focus are a bit more rapid. So even contextual based mean time to resolution could be something. The other stuff, how do you bring the security, how do you measure fundamentally the security muscle of a development team? So how many features they deploy versus how many bug fixes from a security perspective they fix. If they have a consistent muscle, those two metrics are balanced. And it's not rocket science. It's just deciding and agreeing as a contract what's good look like and what agreement you can bring to the table, agreeing it with your development, crystallizing that as a metric, presenting it to the executive and measuring it and reporting upon. So I think we can codify the concept of trust in development, in security, and we can build a better world where fundamentally this concept is codified, the measurement of it is automated and reported above consistently across teams so that you can build fundamentally secure or scorecard for teams to say, are you doing good or bad? And that can be only done with data.
And it should be done, yes, and it should be done with good data. And as you were describing, it should be done with good metrics that are driving the behaviors you want to see. Because I don't think it's going to surprise anybody here that if you have bad KPIs, bad metrics, that's also going to lead to bad decisions, or you're just going to manage to the metric rather than fundamentally improve your security baseline, something like that. As we talk about this, you're also mentioning how this is building trust and security capability. I think was one of the terms you used for the development team, and that goes back to something I think around education. John's really good about pointing this out around educating just at the university level. And I think you had mentioned too, or maybe it's time to mention security champions. How does that security champion role exist here on the DevOps side of the fence? And what are ways, again, either looking to buy-in from stakeholders or metrics or KPIs that point to have security champions programs successful? What are some of the ingredients, or what are some of the ways that you can make a security champions be a good part of this rather than just an exercise that you're doing because everybody else is doing it?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because traditionally, or I think maybe the industry has sold the awareness and security champion program as the solution for Appsec, whereas actually it's not. It's just one step in the ladder. So for the way this program of work deployed correctly, HSBC of the case and various other organizations, was, where security champion was an instrument of education, of development, but empowered with good data. If you give good to, as we rightfully say, if we give good data to team to fundamentally cascade this with both development and executive, then you have a good program of work, because then you use proactively the human side based on data and to inform and have contextual and constructive conversation. Where I see this not used correctly, where security champion were just a tick in the box, and they fundamentally were expensive resource security people, expensive, that fundamentally were running around just trying to chase people around the inconsistent data that they had around how much an application is composed and how they're composed, what is the business value, or who is responsible even for a repository, who is responsible for now. The traditionally should be the responsibility of the business. But because we're so bad at creating the concept of assets and asset management, and then linking it to actually the concept of vulnerability, security champions were fundamentally just a very expensive resource deployed at scale to actually cover the majority of the team, or fundamentally to cover the gap of inconsistent and bad data and the absence of automation. So that is good to kick off the work, to discover fundamentally the pain point, to just say, we could do it better with this. But generally speaking, what I've seen with a lot of programs is they cost a lot and they end up dying. And that creates fundamentally the first generation of security champion or security enabled people. And then if you don't have the management support and you don't continue on this, then you have a bunch of developers that then probably they go back to actually, instead of doing security stuff, they go back to do development because that's what they're paid for. And you don't have a central function from security that serves. So when I see this successful is where you have a central function of developer/security people that are hybrid that fundamentally serve the development community. And the security champion activity is just discussing with them how they can achieve something. For example, if you have the majority of team that struggle right now with authentication or do better authentication, then you do a program of work on educating how to use security token or how to use a consistent way to authenticate against your authentication database. Or you build tool to actually and library that they can use at scale. That's a very good use of the security resource at scale, but you can only detect this if you have a centralized approach on data and you see what are systemically are they failing at. Or in this particular case, you could have noticed that you have a very antiquated version of Apache and a very antiquated version of a specific other library. Now, we just have the Log4j example, but there are tons of other vulnerabilities that have been exploited in the wild and at scale. So you could look at the data and say, okay, what systemically can do? How many times has this container been deployed? If we secure this, can we actually hit as many targets as possible and be proactive? Having this conversation actually help everybody because drive program of work that are systemic, but you can only do that based on data.
I like that distinction between the security champion doesn't exist just to become someone that you get to assign all those vulnerability tickets to. They're the person to, as you're saying, work on those systemic issues. And you're making a good case and highlighting the importance of collecting data. My question there is, how easy is it to collect that data, or where does that data come from? Is this in here? I'm just kind of perhaps a leading question. Are we looking at tools, processes? Is some data easier to collect than others, which is why teams might just go for the easy data collection at the consequence of missing out better metrics or better KPIs that they could be managing towards?
Yeah, that's fundamentally the crux of the matter. That's data and data model is complicated because deployment are complicated. So you need to have a very good engineering team and probably a program of work. And fundamentally, that's what we created Appsec Phoenix to make it easy for everybody to kind of aggregate in a single point all that data. You can still do that relatively to a specific percentage by yourself by collecting data from your cloud deployment, from your CI/CD pipeline, linking, for example, how you deploy application, where you deploy those applications, kind of tracking those applications in repository, for example, with a simple ID and tag, and then gluing in fundamentally the value or the risk position of those applications into from your CMDB, if you have a CMDB, or by having conversation with your project management. The thing is, it's complex because there are 2 or 3 realms. There is the assets where those data are deployed or fundamentally where they originate from. There is all the metadata around how they use or how many times are deployed. And then there is other domains that you can bring in, that is how visible is a specific vulnerability, for example, by threat actor, or you have the whole, an example of it could be the exploitation of or the leakage of specific Git repository in dark web or in specific chatters or keys or accounts. So there is a lot of threat intelligence that you can bring into the mix. So the more data you have, the more visibility you have, the more you see things with the eye of an attacker, but with automation in place. So you link the concept of deployment, you link the concept of assets, you link the concept of vulnerability, and then you link the concept of threat intelligence. And in this way, you have a very, very powerful tool to not do this with human, but to use the human in an intelligent way. And I have a way of saying that usually makes people smile, that is, don't use a tool as a tool, otherwise you become a tool. So use the tool as an instrument to actually make a decisions. Otherwise, you become a tool in a part of a mix.
I'd pause there just because I did have to smile at that. I like that sentiment a lot. And I think that sort of just leads me back to maybe a question I've asked already, but you set up this very nice narrative about the CI/CD to deployment, threat intelligence. Then just to maybe reiterate, this is a good conversation that the 3 of us are having. We understand the AppSec context. what then, help us just understand that aspect of bringing this story up to the business, so we can say, what does that conversation look like when we bring it to the business that say, yep, we hooked up our REST APIs using protobuf communication between our CI/CD tools. I don't think that's what the direction you're going, but you're sort of saying, just help us understand what that story looks like when you do bring it to that risk-based discussion with the business stakeholders.
Right, and that's the other side of the aspect. So at this point in time, you have a database or a data lake fundamentally of intelligence and information and how your organization is structured. Now you need to add that concept of metadata that enables you to have the contextual aware conversation. And this is fundamentally taking your organization with a lens of who you're talking to. So an executive are talking about risk, are talking about quantification, are talking about exposure, are talking about how bad is bad or how I'm going to be impacted. So you need to layer on this concept of deployment, on this concept of how the application is composed, so how much revenue does it bring you, and how you convert this vuln into risk, because fundamentally each kind of vuln or scanner of the case will bring you your concept of bad is bad. So how high is high? So unless you contextualize those kind of elements with your where they are deployed and how exposed they are, and risk assess this whole factor and generating this into a risk-based formula. And the more curated and consistent the risk formula is, the better it is. It doesn't need to be perfect. And we work a lot on our risk formula, but it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect. It needs to be consistent and consistently agreed and brought it back with to the executive with a narrative of, this is our current risk position with the information that we know. This is the current risk exposure on how much an attack could impact us in terms of revenue generating. And at that point, you link fundamentally the concept of vulnerability, how you construct fundamentally your application. Eventually, your threat intelligence all wrap up in a concept of risk that a business owner, an application owner, or an executive can then make a decision on. And in that way, you avoid fundamentally the conversation that is traditionally the board asks, I saw an attack on AppSec, how are we managing our AppSec? And the executive will immediately make a decision of, maybe we fix high critical vulnerability in 5 days. And that's a very bad approach to AppSec, because you can't have a blanket statement like that. It's not risk-based, and you find cases where applications are not deployed, not managed anymore, especially in larger organizations, and applications that have maybe need a little bit more level of maturity, or maybe the application lifecycle or the application patching or the application muscle is across the board of like 3, 4, 6 sprints. And they are like a month, 2 months. So these blanket statement SLAs are not enabling that level of conversation. So just to summarize, fundamentally, you need to build your whole concept of deployment, your whole concept of how applications are deployed. You enrich this information with contextual aware information. You risk assess the hell out of it. You bring the concept of business impact assessment, and then you present a story to the executive, but as well, based on the same data that engineers are going to use.
Yeah, and I love that. Answering how bad is bad is a nice motivating question, but there's also how good is good. And speaking of which, what are some good things that people can turn to learn more about either the work you're doing with Cloud Security Alliance or anything else you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, so with Cloud Security Alliance, we do tons of webinars. We talked extensively on this. I talked about this and how we did successful an application security program work in HSBC at AppSec Cali. So there are tons of videos on that presentation. I did of recent a talk around, demystifying CVE, CWE, the complexity around it at the Open Security Summit. And we do consistently blogging on AppSec Phoenix, or you can follow me on Twitter at FrankSec42 or on LinkedIn, where I post on daily. We also have done a small write-up, small, it's growing by the day, on Log4j of recently to try to demystify and also track actively the attack vectors and how this thing is growing, and how we solve this for a number of clients by having this good asset management and these good stories and acting on early on this.
Oh, absolutely. And I want to thank you for bringing us some of those good stories. Appreciate you taking the time to chat with us, Francesco.
Absolutely. Mike, John, absolute pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you once again. I want to thank John. I want to thank everybody for listening. Go definitely check out Francesco's Twitter feed and his LinkedIn feed. He's got some interesting stuff and entertaining stuff going on. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and return with news, you know what's coming, of the week.